Okay, we're recording. We're dealing with the cultural and literary background of between the testaments. And so, first of all, we are using a book that's written by a denominational fellow, and I'm using the book for its historical information and of what was happening between the Old Testament and the New Testament. In other words, between the Testament. But this book contains doctrinal error. Okay, and so when you read it, I started showing some of the era, but I didn't have time to type in everything. So as we go through the book, I'll try to point things out, and I may miss some. But what we're trying to do is get the historical information that is essential about the cultural and the literary background. And so the years of, as we've already pointed out, 200 BC to 100 AD uh, referred to generally as the intertestamental testamental period. And I don't think that people would agree with Russell, his name, who wrote this book on that, because we usually say from the 4 AD. And so on my notes, and you'll get them again, I'm going for 4 BC. That's what we usually say. And so I'm going to change. Well, let me do this way. We'll leave it at 100, and I'll make a mark there to go back and change that. Let me fix that the way I usually do with that of blue on blue. And we'll come back and fix that. But we usually say between 100, 200, I think it's 86 BC, really around 300 BC, all the way down to 4 BC, that we look at the intertestament period. So, that's what Russell says. And it is of fundamental importance both for Christianity and also for Judaism. Russell is going to use a man by the name of Charles, Dr. Charles. I forget the first initial now. And he's the one that also expresses a lot of things, and we'll bring it up when we get to his name, maybe later on. But he has studied the intertestamental period so much, and he's brought out a lot of things. We know and we understand that Judaism, with that of Judaism, that when the Christ came, that everything was in order for the eternal plan to begin in reference to revealing the Christ and so forth. But we always talk about, that everything was right. They had one language. They were scattered abroad. They had built synagogues, and other things like that. They picked up the Greek culture and so forth. But he goes a little bit further than all of those things. And he points out some of the errors that the Jewish people had picked up, and the reason they had picked them up because of that of the culture that they were in. And that was the reason why that there are questions that are asked in the New Testament, and sometimes if we go back and say, well, why are they asking those questions, and then go back to that of the intertestament period, we may find the reason why. So when we think Russell makes reference to that of the rabbinical Judaism, and because it was during these centuries that a very special sense, the way was being prepared for the emergency of these two great religious faiths, talking about Christianity and Judaism. So the purpose of our study, he says, is to examine, albeit in outline, the culture and literature of these momentous years, and to consider the development of certain religious beliefs whose influence was to be felt particularly within the growing Christian church. And so we're going to see some of that, but we would make reference to that the Jewish people were picking up some of those, but also we have to remember the church of Christ was made up of that of people from a Jewish background and also from a Gentile background. So they had picked up some of these same things, but Charles and Russell deal with some of those. So throughout the whole of this period, the Jews were surrounded by Greek culture and civilization, and particularly in a dispersion. Now, later on in our discussion, we'll talk a lot about the dispersion. And actually, if we don't finish all of his book that I've outlined, and I've outlined all of it, some of it I don't think it's worth outlining, but I've outlined the majority of it. But one part that I really like about his book is the discussion of the dispersion. So we're going to talk about that. as when we get there. But many of those, because the Jewish people had been scattered, that they had to adopt the Greek language either as their own language or as an alternative to the Aramaic tongue. And so my understanding basically is that many of them were knew both languages very well. And again, if we go back to Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 8, we find the different languages that were there in reference to the different dialects. Now, we have to remember the word tongue there means dialect because these people heard them speak in their own dialects of the Greek language. And so if they didn't speak the Greek language, I would assume that somebody spoke Aramaic, and therefore all the Jews would understand Aramaic. So it was conclusive that they should be influenced and influenced deeply by the Hellenistic environment in which they lived. And we find that problem in Acts chapter 6 when you have the uh, Hellenistic widows that had come to uh, worship in Jerusalem on Pentecost, and some of them stayed. They were being neglected because they were Hellenistic. They had the Greek culture. And so the apostles had to step in and point out to them that they were to take care of everybody. So it was this. It's surprising. The surprising thing is that their response to it was not much greater. That, despite the pressure brought to bear upon them, they were able to maintain their distinctive Jewish faith. But when you start looking at what they were doing in some of the synagogues, they were picking up different things. And so at intervals between 170 and 70 AD, that should be 170 BC, and 70 AD, Jewish nationalism played a most important part in resisting the inroads of Hellenism. So as we shall see, this nationalism was motivated not by political aims, but aims only, but also by religious ideas springing from a deep piety on the part of the many and rooted in strong theological convictions. Judaism, unlike Hellenism, represented not so much a way of life as a national religious. This fellow named Dr. F.C. Burkett, he writes on the Judaism for these two half centuries, and he describes it as an alternative to civilization as being understood. Not only was it alternative, but it's also alternative for the belief of many. It would lead men at last to the kingdom of God, whose coming would usher in the new age of God's appointing. And we would understand that to be the eternal purpose in reference to that, what the Bible points out to us, in Ephesians chapter 3. Down in Ephesians chapter 3, beginning there in verse 9 down to verse 11. So we're talking about the eternal purpose of God, even though he mentions it a different way. And so those are some of the things that I'll try to change between now and next time. As we go through, I'm going to make some notes in reference to that, so I may stutter around. Well, there is the rise and the spread of this Hellenism. And I think it will help us as we look at this, because we will look at the cultural background. And as I said, we offer at the School of Preaching a course in biblical culture, the culture of our backgrounds of Christianity in reference to that of the culture of the day. So the word Hellenism is common used to describe the civilization of 3 centuries, 336 BC, all the way to 320 BC. And so during the time of Alexander the Great, 336 to 323 BC. So during that, which the influence of Greek culture was felt in both East and West, it was cherished, described desire of this ruler, that is Alexander Campbell, to found a worldwide empire. Sometimes it makes me think of, even today, during back the time of President Clinton, that he wanted a world economy and all that kind of thing. So this is what Alexander the Great wanted. He wanted to be bound together in a unity of language, customs, and civilization, and in great military conquest. He did much to realize that idea, but he would come to an understanding in reference to that of the Jewish religion. And so that becomes some problems, because he's trying to unite them with this language and some customs and things of that sort, and there will be some problems in that. But eventually, those that were scattered abroad, those that was in dispersion, they accepted some of the Greek culture. That's the reason why you have some problems when the people come from the dispersion to the city of Jerusalem. Some of them stay. Then also same reason why we have problems in Romans and first in the Corinthian letters, the Galatian letters, and others is because of this process that was taking place. So from a very early stage, the Jews must have felt the impact of this culture upon their manner of life, and particularly upon their religion. And when we stop and think about that, see, we understand as we read the New Testament that the Old Testament has been done. I mean, the Old Testament, that especially the law of Moses, has been done away with all of its offering and sacrifices and their 10 Commandments and so forth. However, when we turn to the New Testament, we find that the Jews, as they obey the gospel, they still want to hold on to some of those things. Well, here it's the other way around. Now they're wanting to hold on to their Jewish religion, but yet here's this culture that they're in, the Hellenism. So apart from a comparatively small area around about Jerusalem, they were not a state, but rather a dispersion, scattered not only throughout Palestine, but in every part of the Roman Empire. And so that's the reason why that we see, and again in Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 8, he talks about all of those, but he says also that in Rome, and also he talks about proselytes in Asia and so forth. And so they were especially open to the influence of Hellenism through the medium of commerce and trade. It was the policy of Alexander and also his successors to send Greek colonists in the train of their armies and to plant them as traders in conquered lands as they traded. And so in these lands, particularly in the east, would be many Jews who had exiled from Palestine and had immigrated and settled in Greek cities further west. Jewish communities were soon to be found in such places in Syria and Antioch and Damascus and Asia Minor and Macedonia and Greece and Cyprus and Cyrene and Rome. Now, I think it's very interesting that when we read those is that we turn to the New Testament book of Acts and we'll find all those places. I mean, that's where the Jewish communities were. So that's where Paul went to the Gentiles and the Jews and the kings, according to what the Bible says. But Peter, when we go over and read Peter's epistles and everything, and also like again on the day of Pentecost, we find there are a lot of people there from these areas, or wherever they were under a Seleucid or a Catholic rule. They had a long time enjoyed the blessings of religious liberty under a policy of religious toleration, which would no doubt leave them open to subtle influences of the Hellenistic culture. And so we find when we read the New Testament that usually this freedom that they had was actually taken away in the destruction of Jerusalem because the Romans turned upon them and they were killing not only Jews but also Christians. But with the promise that was made by Jesus was simply in Matthew 24 is that the Christians, or Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13, is that basically that the Christians would leave and not any of them would be killed. And so, but we find that many Jews were killed, according to what Josephus tells us. So the Romans, they encouraged the development of this culture, and especially in the eastern provinces, sought by this means to realize the dreams of Alexander the Great. So in this regard, there was no break between the Greek and the Roman regimes, or indeed between the years BC and the years AD. Hellenistic culture and the civilization was characteristic of the whole Greco-Roman period, and it is against this broad historical cultural background that we are going to study the reaction of the Jewish people and their religious faith. I always think I used as a kid would watch wrestling a lot, and they would talk about the Greco-Roman wrestling, and so you find that it's kind of something that most of that was happening in this area. So the Septuagint, when we think about literature, the Septuagint and Hellenistic literature. From an early date, there were Jewish settlements in Egypt, and we've already noticed that because Alexandria soon won for itself an honor name, particularly at the literary center. And it was here that the Septuagint translation of the scriptures in the Greek tongue emerged from the use of Greek-speaking Jews in Egypt who were no longer able to read Hebrew, and for whom the translation given in the synagogue service was proven inadequate. So they would translate the Hebrew, Aramaic, into that Koine group. And so we find that we brought this up, but Russell brings out more in his book in reference to that. We find that the translation of the Torah or the Pentateuch took place probably during the reign of Ptolemy II, 285 247 BC. The name Septuagint being extended later to cover other parts of the Old Testament. Now, most of the time, people don't realize, they think the translation was done all at one time. You know, it's like they went from Genesis to the book of Malachi, but that wasn't so. The Jews were more interested in that of the Pentateuch, or what they call the Torah. And so later, though, the other parts of the Old Testament was added to that of the Septuagint. Not only did they have a Torah, but they also had all the other books, especially like with the Law of Moses and all the way through to that of the prophets. And so in the letters to Aristides, which at a later date accompanied the Greek Bible, there is a legend that the Septuagint was the result of a royal command of Ptolemy II of Egypt, who gave the task of translation in the hands of 72 elders. Now, in later forms of the story, the number is given as 70. And so sometimes there's a discussion about that, but the thing of it is, the word Septuagint, and sometimes they look at Septuagint, and then sometimes you'll find capitals LXX, and that's the Roman numerals for 70. So these men carried out their work of translation in separate rooms and produced results which were all exactly alike. It is most likely, however, that the Septuagint came into existence as a Greek Targum, just as in Palestine there came into existence the Aramaic Targum for the help of those who were unable to understand Hebrew scripture. And so the influence of the Septuagint upon the Jews of the dispersion, and even more upon the young Christian church, cannot be overestimated. We find actually that Jesus quotes from that of the Septuagint. Apart from the Greek overtones noticeable here and there, which would remind its readers of its cultural background, it was almost seemed to be as a vehicle of Hellenization, but as an instrument for the propagation of Judaism throughout dispersion, it is contributed with inestimable importance. And so in Alexandria, many Greek books were written and sent out to many parts of the world, where no doubt they were studied by more learned about the Jews. So these often contained slanderous accusations against the Jewish race, a religion which was commonly regarded as both superstitious and atheistic. And so the Jews, on their part, did not attempt to disguise in their own writings the utter contempt which they had for the heathen. Indeed, the whole Jewish Hellenistic literature from the time of the Septuagint all the way down to Josephus at the end of the first century AD had its aim at the condemnation of idolatry, and chiefly by ridicule and the defense of Judaism against the encroachments of such heathen influence. So much of this literature is known to us only in fragments or in reference to other works, but those writings have survived show quite clearly the mixture of Greek and Jewish thought that had taken place long before the Christian era. And we have to stop there and make a comment. Most people look at Josephus because Josephus was kind of prejudiced. He was a Jewish person, but the Romans allowed him to write, so he kind of leaned toward the Romans more so than that of the Jews. So we would think that as we go back and we read all these different books that are between the testaments, and we gain our history from them, we have to realize that the same thing can be done. We're not simply saying that since we go back and read the books and look at them and draw things from them that we accept all the history, everything they're saying. We just make sure that when we look at writer A, and then we may look at a writer D, and we find that there are some discrepancies between the two. It's like there are some discrepancies with Josephus and the other historians. And so we have to make sure that we understand that. This is well illustrated in such book as the Sibylline Oracles, Book 3, and the Wisdom of Solomon. We'll talk about the Wisdom of Solomon even more so. But these Sibylline Oracles were written during the latter half of the 2nd century BC in Alexandria. And they are imitative of the Greek syllabus, which exercised a considerable influence on pagan through both before and after this time. And so the pagan symbol was a prophetess who, under the inspiration of the God, little g, that is their God, was able to impart wisdom to men and to reveal to them the divine will and so forth. We have to remember that this is the time that we're looking at 400 years of silence by God. So that means we go all the way back to 400 BC down to 4 BC. And so 400 years. And so we don't have anything directly from that of inspired by that of God. Now we do have God's providence working out his plan. We need to remember that. He has a plan, God does. That plan is being worked out. And so there were many varieties of such oracles in different countries. And Egypt in particular, they came to have an increasing interest in the significance. The Alexandrian Jews saw in this type of literature an excellent medium of propaganda. So by judicious alteration and expansion, they used the framework of the pagan oracles to propagate the faith of the true and only living God. Now, that was great of them to do that, but their problem they were having is that, again, when you go back, you find they were dispersed, but yet as they dispersed, they were picking up these cultural things in reference to Greek culture. And not only that, but they had not always obeyed God themselves. So much greater significance is the wisdom of Solomon. I thought this was an interesting book. And I may, when I have the time, I may sit down and read it. But it was written in the first century BC by a Jew of Alexandria who, in presenting his faith, shows that he had been deeply influenced in his thinking by the outlook and philosophy of the Gentile Greek world, that he was no doubt well read in the field. Now, I stopped there because we said the first century BC. Now, if we take as we would say, the 400 BC down to 4 BC, then we're talking about 4 BC is when Christ was born, according to the reckoning of time. And so this is 3 years. And if you stop and think about that, that was the time that Herod was having all the babies killed. Okay. So we need to realize that. We'll find some other things about Josephus also in reference to that, but why he doesn't mention the destruction of the babies. And so it may have been because of the wars that they were fighting and things of that sort, but we'll see something of that. His influence, though, for example, in his treatment of the idea of wisdom, which he personified in a way to that of the Stoic teaching. And we remember now, if we go Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul quotes the Stoics. So we see some of that there. I mean, it's nothing wrong in quoting them because what they said was true. It was biblical. I mean, it's not that they were quoting the Bible, but what that was being said, we're the offspring of God, and that's true. So teaching concerning the all-pervading logos or word. I have 4 books on that, on logos, volume 1, 2, 3, and 4, and I've never read them all through. I just look at them sometimes. Interesting. But indeed, a bold attempt to bring together the piety of Orthodox Judaism and the Greek thoughts of the age, in keeping with that of other Jewish writings of this time. It incorporates a powerful polemic against the Gentiles and oppose a true religion that revealed through God's servant Moses. Now, again, we have to realize, yes, God is silent, but yet they still have that of the Old Testament. Now they have it in the Septuagint, the Torah, first 5 books of the Old Testament, they have it in Greek. So an outstanding example of Hellenistic Judaism is to be found in the Alexander Jewish writer Philo. You remember we talked about him because he's a philosopher. He was a contemporary of Jesus and of Paul, and he was well read not only in the Hebrew scripture, but also in the Jewish Hellenistic writings and the Greek philosophies as well. As in our other studies, we just simply meant that he pointed out that he was a student of Greek philosophy. And so the aims of his writing, though, was to demonstrate the relation between the religion of the scriptures and the truth of the Greek philosophies. He made free use of the common Alexandrian practice of the allegorism, and by this means he demonstrated, for example, that Moses was at one with the Greek philosophers. For example, that Moses was with them, but his position was not accepted by the Orthodox Judaism of his day, but his approach to religion and philosophy and the relation between them had a very considerable influence on the development of Christian theology in the years to come. Now, that would simply be, we're not talking about the Bible now. We're talking about Christian theology after the Bible was written. These people from Germany and other places, and some of their theology, Barth and so forth, is developed on some of that of Philo. And so we would see some of that. But the Greek culture in Palestine, um, the impact of Hellenism on Judaism was felt even in Palestine itself, where for most part the Jews belonged to the dispersion and lived as members of a Greek community. So during the time of the Seleucids, many cities in Palestine were won over to Greek way of life, and some new cities modeled on Greek lines or came into being. And these communities and their method of government by a democratic senate resembling the Athenian Boule or council, elected annually and comprising that of representatives of the people, would bring to the Jews an entirely new mental outlook and a hitherto unknown insight of the Hellenistic culture and civilization, much of which to the loyal Jew would appear to be unedifying and even subversive of his faith. Now, we're talking about, when we say loyal Jew, we're talking about those who are actually doing what the Old Testament taught them to do, what the books from Exodus all the way down to the book of Malachi as they were being translated, and so they knew what they were supposed to be doing. And so, even in Jerusalem and its immediate environs, there were many who adopted the Greek way of life as early as the period of the Ptolemaic supremacy, and that would be in Egypt, and many more succumbed the concentrated propaganda of the Seleucids. We've used the first book of Maccabees, and it is quoted in the text, and then I also put it in from another. I don't know. I don't think they're the same, but they may be the same. Well, they're not the same. My ends were sowed to do mischief, and this says sowed themselves to be evil. And so I left that, and I'm going to drop down because we'll read it in the book. Okay, here's what he used. Says there, the first book of Maccabees throws light on the situation at that time in these words. He says, in those days there came forth out of Israel transgressors of the law. Get that? Transgressors of the law. And persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles that are around us, for since we parted from them, many evils have befallen us. And the saying was good in their eyes, and certain of the people were forward therein, and went to the king, and he gave them license to do after the ordinances of the Gentiles. And they built a place of exercise in Jerusalem according to the laws of the Gentiles. They joined, and they made themselves uncircumcised. I don't know how they could do that, uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. First Maccabees 1:11 through 15. And see, that's very interesting to me that those were taking place, because again, when we come to that of the New Testament, because you have all those Pharisees and Sadducees and the Essenes and the Herodians and the Zealots. We'll see some more about them, and we see things about them, and yet we find that some of these Jewish people, the things that they had done, and so my computer has stopped. There he goes. So an important factor in spreading this rival culture was undoubtedly the formation of gymnasiums, which sprang up, and we talked about those not only though in Jerusalem. Now we know they had them in Jerusalem, but we find many parts of the dispersion in Palestine and far beyond. They express, says Dr. Edwin Bevan, fundamental tendencies of the Greek mind. Its craving for harmonious beauty of form, its delight in the body, its unabashed frankness with regard of everything natural. And yet we can see when you go back and you look at the between the testaments there and the oncoming of that of the Caesars and so forth, and you can pick out. I mean, they have statues, and the statues, they don't have clothes on, and not only of men but also women, and some of their gods were also the very same way. So the Greek emphasis was on beauty and shape, and movement would open up aesthetic horizons hitherto until unknown to many Jews. And for that reason, some of the Jewish religious rites, which appears aesthetic to the Jews, would be neglected by certain Jews. They wouldn't do them. We showed from that of First Maccabees that it shows there Jewish athletes, for example, who would normally run naked on the track, being uncircumcised by means of a slight surgical operation as an avoid derision of the crowd. They made themselves look like they'd never been circumcised. And so I think that's kind of going to some extreme, in reference to that. But we see that today in transgender, though. I mean, we see people what they're going to do, and therefore they have to do some things and change things surgically and manipulate many things. Games among that of these people, the games and the races in the stadiums and the hyperdrome was distinctive marks of that of the Hellenized city and were popular with Jewish youth no less than with those of other religious and cultural backgrounds. In other words, it was interesting. It's like with us today. I mean, our country is given over to sports. I mean, I don't know how many channels ESPN has and how many channels Fox Sports has, and NBC Sports and CBS Sports and ABC Sports. ABC is mostly ESPN, but yet there are all kinds of things. I have where I use streaming, and in my streaming, I mean, I have probably 100 or more stations in reference to sports that you can watch. So we find that came that way there too. Even the theater, who played an important part in the dissemination of the Greek culture. We know of Jews who themselves wrote tragedies in Greek verse and whose plays, like the Exodus by certain Ezekiel, were no doubt performed in the theater where Herod built near to the temple in Jerusalem. So religious rites and ceremonies with which many of the games and performances were associated would have conclusively influenced that on the Jewish population and would tend to corrupt the minds of the youth, accompanied as they often were by measure of immorality and vice. For the Hellenism, with which the Jews came into contact during this period, while containing much that was good and beautiful, had in popular mind a close connection with the groves of Daphne, and so the ways of soldiers, brothel keepers, and traders. So we see there in reference to that of pimps and prostitution and so forth that was there. And so you had the reaction of the influence that of the Hellenism, though. It's obvious from what has been said so far that the influence of Hellenism could not be confined to the strictly social, literary, or cultural or aesthetic fields. By its very nature, it created definitely spiritual atmosphere, which was in many respects completely foreign to that of the Jewish religious outlook. And when we read passages like in the Romans chapter 1, and also we turn and we read 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we see what the Gentile people were involved in, and yet we find that some of the Jewish people had also picked out some of those things up also. And so the various festivals and ceremonies associated with almost every part of Greek social life would leave their imprint on the religious life and customs of that of the Jewish people. Not only the Jewish people, but also the Greek or the Gentile people, as we look upon it. It is important, though, for us that we observe that the Hellenism was a syncretistic, the word, it's got that D-I-S and D-I-C, syncretistic, system beneath whose service the thought and beliefs of many old Eastern religious religions continue to exist a potent influence. So within the Syrian branch of Hellenism, for example, Zoroastrian religion, and we talked about that some already, the old Persian Empire were very much alive. Now, notice what we said, the old Persian Empire, because the Persian Empire had been taken over, but yet that religion had not been. The religion continued to spread. And the reason for it is because when the Persian people were in charge, people, they would look at what Zoroastrianism was. And so they would, some of them would convert to that, and it was carried on. So in its early form, at any rate, Zoroastrianism taught a dualism in which there was envisioned an age-long struggle between the powers of light and led by the good spirit Ahura Mazda, and the powers of dark led by the evil spirit Angra Mainyu. And so this dualistic principle is worked out in a doctrine of two ages, in which the present age of ungodliness is set over the future age of righteousness. At last, though, through the good offices of Shashaya, the Savior, Hira Mazda cast Angra Mainyu into the abyss. the end of the world comes, the dead are raised and face the judgment. All men are subject to the flame of a purifying fire. And at least all are saved, and the new age appears with a new heaven and a new earth. Sounds like we know today in reference to some of the things that they believe. I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to close my door. Somebody's in the kitchen making noises. Okay, I'll be back. Alongside the teaching of Zoroaster, I'm going to just say Zoroastrianism uh, meant the old Babylonian worship of the heavenly luminaries, in other words, the stars and so forth, and especially the seven planets, which in their revolutions around the earth were believed to control the lives of men and that of nations. Now we do know that God created all things, and we understand the moon helps us with our tides, and so sun gives us heat, that type of thing. We understand those things, but this was a worship type thing, and the survivor of this worship is quite understandable because the Persian Empire, which Alexander the Great had taken over, had itself succeeded the old Babylonian Empire in process, had incorporated many of its customs and beliefs and had adopted its languages, in Aramaic and Chaldee, and official languages of Chaldee, the official language of that of the government. Thus emerged a Perso-Babylonian syncretism, or as we would say, a mixture of culture. And so, which in course of time colored deeply Syrian Hellenism. So through the medium of that of Syrian Hellenism, the impact of this culture would be felt by the Jews in Palestine. Indeed, many of the Jews would have direct contact with the Persian Babylonian thought and the culture because of the time from the time of the captivity. So they had lived side by side with Iranians, Persians in Mesopotamia. And from time to time, those Babylonian Jews would return to Palestine, bringing back with them a sympathetic appreciation of some of the aspects of Persian thought, and particularly those which were not necessarily incompatible with their own Hebrew religion. No doubt many would be attracted back to Palestine in the times of the Maccabees, their successors, when a strong Jewish state came into being. So here's the influence of Zoroastrianism. And indeed, the whole Perso-Babylonian culture is amply illustrated in the writings of that of the Jewish apocalyptics uh, of this period, and even though to a lesser extent in the works of the Pharisaic Judaism. Evident, and the reason for that would be because the Pharisees were people who were that stuck close to the law. Legalism was they because they stuck to the law. So it's evident too in the writings of the Quran coveters that we talked about, which there appeared, for example, a form of dualism in many of ways similar to that of Zoroastrianism, which cannot be explained simply by a reference to Old Testament religion. And so an acquaintance with Zoroastrian eschatology, that is the doctrine of last things, and this is where later on that we'll see a lot of that and how that Dr. Charles brings that up and some of the things that he's accepted. I often wondered, and I remember Brother Mike Gifford talking about the Gospel of John in one of the classes. I think it's stayed in the whole class, but he was teaching the class here at Cartersville. He was talking about the Jewish people and how that they had this mentality of a physical kingdom in that of the city of Jerusalem. And I used to stop and talk about the doctrine of life things. And when we look, we need to stop and think, well, were the Jews influenced by that of all this culture that was taking place and the gathering of all the different cultures into one, that they too began to believe the same thing in reference to what we call premillennialism. That is, it's going to be an earthly kingdom, not a spiritual. And so the acquaintance with that, the doctrine of the last thing, is indicated in the Old Testament itself. But the Jewish apocalypse, including the writer of the book of Daniel, are much more stronger influenced by it. Their whole outlook is governed by the belief that this present evil age was fast and drawn to a close, that the new age would speedily be ushered in. So this dualistic view of the universe colored their beliefs concerning the messianic hope, for example, which in course of time assumed transcendent characteristics, and also their conception of life after death. And in this later case, Zoroastrianism influenced. It's evident such matters as the separation of the soul from the body at death, the light, the departed between death and resurrection, the doctrine of resurrection, and teaching the concerning the last judgment. And another realm in which this influence was deeply felt is in the greatly developed doctrine of angels and demons, in particular in the personalization of evil spirits, for which there is no parallel in all of the Old Testament. So even more important than Syrian Hellenism was Egyptian Hellenism. And so we see again, even though that it's Greek culture, but yet they all didn't accept everything. They all had their own form. And so now we look at the Egypt Hellenism of shape under the Ptolemies. Old religious and mystic traditions of Egypt and Babylonia came into contact with the new Greek science and culture and producing a system of thought much more abstract and informed from the Syrian branches of Hellenism. Many of us think in reference to that. We have a lot of movies in reference to some of the things like the Raiders of the Lost Ark and all that other type of stuff that Indiana Jones did, and so many others that sometimes we forget that basically some of the things that they did in reference to burial and graves and the pyramids and all that type of thing is that those things are talked about. Many of the Jews, especially those of the dispersion, were greatly influenced by the philosophical type of religion which accompanies this form of Greek culture. Now, this point is well illustrated, and I told you we'd get into some of that of the wisdom of Solomon, one of these books, and whose familiarity with Greek thought was evident. For example, in his teaching concerning wisdom, he says the idea of wisdom is familiar enough to the reader of the Old Testament in such books as Proverbs and Job and Ecclesiastes, but in the wisdom of Solomon, the influence of Greek philosophy is most clearly marked. Now, that's interesting. That maybe if we were to read that book, we may see some of the influences that carried on today, but we may see some of the influences of that of the wisdom of Solomon, this book, in reference to that of the New Testament times. It's mostly the author's teaching of divine and human wisdom, B.M. Metzger writes, an explication of the earlier ideas on this subject expressed in the book of Proverbs with a metaphysical twist borrowed from the Stoic conception of the universal logos. Talk about the logos, talk about the beginning was the word, that's the logos. The word became flesh, though. That impersonal mediator between God and creation, having created the world out of a formless matter, in Wisdom of Solomon 11:17. For thy, if you drop down there a little bit, you'll see that for thy almighty hand that made the world of matter without form, wanted not means to send among them a multitude of heirs or fierce lions. And so, but you can go back and read Genesis 1 and 2. That's what he says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That we says in verse 2 there that it was without form. And so God sends this creation a soul, which is none other than wisdom itself. That this is what the wisdom of Solomon teaches. And the spirit of wisdom comes from God. He says, wherefore I prayed, understand was given me. I called upon God, and the spirit of wisdom came upon me. And is a clear effluence of the glory of Almighty, chapter 7 and verse 25. Wherefore he says there, for she is the breath of the power of God and a pure influence flowing from the glory of Almighty, therefore can no defiled thing fall into her. God created all things by his word, chapter 9, verse 1. O God, my fathers. What's that? O God of my fathers. I left that out. And the Lord of mercy, who has made all things with thy word. Now, you stop for a moment and think that when you read Genesis chapters 1 and 2, he says, let us, and so he's speaking there, let us create. In other words, let there be light. That was his word. Let there be the firmament. That was his word. Let the sun, moon, and stars. Let there be light, and so forth. And so in chapter 9 and verse 9, wisdom was present before creation. As for I, thy servant and son of thy handmaid, am a feeble person and a short time and too young for the understanding of judgment and laws. Because they were before him. He's too young, he says. So since then, it has been the artificer, chapter 7, verse 22. Now I got to move on down and read somewhere else. For wisdom, which is a worker of all things, taught me, for in her is an understanding spirit, holy, one only, manifold, subtle, living, clear, undefiled, plain, and not subject to hurt, loving the thing that is good and quick, and cannot be ready to do good, he says. And so then all of that, we find the the order 8:1 and the reformer 8:5 and of all things. So you go down, and I'm going to read those chapter 1:8 there now. Chapter 7, verse 27, he says, and being but one, she can do all things, remaining in herself. She maketh all things new, and at all ages entered into whole souls, she maketh them friends of God and prophets. Chapter 8, verse 1, wisdom reaches from one end to another mightily, and sweetly does she order all things. Verse 5, if riches be possession to be desired in this life, what is richer than wisdom, the work of all things? Now, watching in chapter 7, verses 22 through 30, he says, for wisdom, which is the worker of all things, taught me, for in her is an understanding spirit, holy, one only, manifold, subtle, living, clear, undefiled, plain, not subject to hurt, loving the thing that is good, quick, which cannot be lettered, ready to do good, kind to man, steadfast, sure, free from care, having all power, overseeing all things, going through all understanding, pure, most subtle spirit. For wisdom is more moving than any motion. She passeth and goeth through all things by reason of her pureness. For she is the breath of power of God and a pure influence flowing from the glory of Almighty. Therefore can no defiled thing fall into her. For she is the brightness of the everlasting light, the unspotted mirror of the power of God and the image of his goodness. Being the one, she can do all things, and remaining in herself, she maketh all things new, and all ages entering the holy soul. She maketh them friends of God and prophet. For God loveth none but him that dwelleth with wisdom, for she is more beautiful than the sun above all the orders of the star, being compared with the light. She is found before it. For after this cometh night, but the by shall not prevail against wisdom. So, the influence of the Greek thought on the wisdom of Solomon is evident after and also in teaching concerning the Platonic doctrine in the pre-existence of the soul. For instance, in chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, he says, and Russell, he quotes another translation of it. He says, now I was a goodly child, and a good soul fell to my lot. Nay, rather, the good, I came into a body. The same idea is presented in the Jewish writer Philo, who died in around 50 AD. And in such a book as Second Enoch, which was somewhere between 1 and 50 AD, where these words appear, sit and write all the souls of mankind. However, many of them are born, and the place is prepared for them to eternity, for all souls are prepared to eternity before the foundation of the world. Now, I give all of that there in a quotation from those books, The Wisdom of Solomon, and also Enoch. So in Second Enoch, though, he says in verses 4 and 5 there, he says, they're prepared for all souls are prepared to eternity. Well, we hear some of that, and I heard some of that when I was growing up. God had souls over here, and every time there was a baby, sperm met the egg, or a woman got pregnant, then he put the soul in it, so forth. But that's not the way it happens. It becomes life, or as a soul. So in most of those Jewish books, particularly those of the apocalyptic character, the belief expressed in a resurrection from the dead, in which the soul or spirit is reunited with the body. But in a few of them, the influence of the Platonic thought is again evident in passage expression belief in the immortality of the soul. And so in the wisdom of Psalm chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, we read, and here I'm going to read what his version says. The souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. No torment shall touch them. I think that's very interesting. I'm studying the book of Revelation. The whole thing there is those people who overcome in the book of Revelation won't be hurt. And Revelation chapter 2 tells us. When we stop and we think about that, in the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died. And their departure was accounted to be their hurt, and their journeying away from us to be their ruin, but they are in peace. Even if in the sight of men they be punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having borne a little chastisement, they shall receive a great good, because God made trial for them and found them worthy of himself. So at least two other books express the same belief. In Enoch, first Enoch chapters, sections 191 through 104, I don't think they're in chapters, around 164 BC. And the writer refutes the Sadducean view that is no different between the lot of the righteous and the lot of the wicked beyond that of death. So it affirms, on the contrary, that all goodness and joy and glory are prepared for the souls of the righteous. They shall live and rejoice, and their spirit shall not perish. And so also in the book of Jubilees. So the righteous pass as once after death in the blessedness of immortality. Their bones shall rest in the earth, and their spirit shall have much joy, he says. So the influence, just stop for a moment and think, in reference to the influence of these different types of Hellenism upon Judaism during this period is clear, but in its fundamental tenets, Judaism remained true to the faith of its fathers and prepared the way not only for its own survival, but also for the birth of that of the Christian religion. And so you and I mean, we know what the Bible says, and we've studied the New Testament. We know what it says in reference to the soul and the body separated and immortality. We know under that, but yet we find that a lot of things, the resurrection had been spoken of. The Pharisees believed it. They believed in spirits. They believed in angels, but the Sadducees rejected all of that. So somewhere along the line, they got influenced by the Greek culture. And so we understand, the influence of these different types of Hellenism. And so we would have next, in reference to that, talk about the reaction against Hellenism. Now, here it is, all these different things that we talked about and made reference to. Mention has been made of a policy of toleration, followed by the Ptolemies and also the Seleucids, by which Jerusalem, Judaism, and Hellenism was allowed to exist side by side. And think about that. I mean, we live in our world, and we're able to live side by side with the denominational world. We, as a late religious group, if we were to look at it from that standpoint, we're able to live side by side with that of the atheists. Also, reference to those people who believe in different things than what we believe in, because of what the Bible teaches. And so these were years of great peril for the Jewish faith. And for this policy aimed at Hellenization through a gradual incorporation of Greek influence and a gradual assimilation out of the Greek way of life. So it was this policy of peaceful penetration was replaced by a policy of persecution, notably in the reign of that of Antiochus IV, 175 to 163 BC. And a violent reaction which developed in time into a burning hatred of the whole Hellenistic way of life. I wonder today, my own personal thoughts in reference to Christianity, how that our country has turned against Christianity. And we see more and more of that. And I mean, all we have to do is look in reference to that of our government and what they're wanting to do in reference to that of our free speech and things of that sort. They would like to take that away from us. They don't want us to be a lot of the things that we read in the Bible. Yet we find this is the way things go in the world in which we live. The Hellenizing party in Jerusalem, long before the reign of Antiochus IV, there had been a strong Hellenizing party among the Jews in Palestine. We've already understood that, whose ringleaders, though, were to be found chiefly in the ranks of the wealthy. And the priestly aristocracy, who by reason of their social position enjoyed the privileges of the royal court and carried the favor of the king. So, moreover, this whole period was marked by bitter rivalry between these two great houses, the house of the Tobias and the house of Onias. We've talked a lot about them because in reference to their being that of the priest, but each of which was influenced deeply the course of events in the coming years. I mean, Tobias and Onias. and particularly in relationship to the high priestly office. And again, Josephus tells us how the high priest Onias II, a great lover of money, refused to pay the annual tribute tax of 20 talents to Ptolemy IV in 221 to 203 BC, whereupon Joseph, the son of Tobias, had himself appointed tax collector for the whole country. And so Joseph and his house became extremely rich and gained for themselves a position of considerably a power in that of the nation. Now you stop and think, here when we think about this, what's going on is reference that when we come to New Testament times, we have people like Matthew, who is a tax collector, you know. And so now we're seeing the reason why the Jewish people, did not like the tax collector. So at this time, these two rival houses were represented in the two highest office in the state. And so in the time of Antiochus the Great, 223 to 187 BC, the control of Palestine passed over from the Ptolemies to the Seleucids, and forthwith Joseph and his followers transferred their allegiance to that monarch whose government was directly in need of that money. So there were men in Jerusalem who were ready to raise or offer money in return for positions of power. So if they became tax collectors, they would collect that money and they would give it to them. So that's what they did. Such as one was of Simon of the house of Tobias, who in the reign of the Seleucids IV, 187, 175, encouraged the king's chief minister to seize the sacred monies in the temple and then tried to incriminate the high priest Onias III. And then that's when they had the riots broke out in Jerusalem, and Onias III set off the Seleucid court to ask help from the king and quelling the disturbances that they were having. And so this feud actually it continued between those two rival houses and came to a head in the reign of Antiochus IV, 175, 163 BC, who succeeded his brother Seleucus, and the Hellenizers in Jerusalem, and in particular in the aristocratic party, who were openly pro-Syrian, saw in the accession of that of Antiochus an opportunity for gaining their end. So the legitimate high priest, now he's the legitimate one, Onias III. Remember, I gave us we have a list of, but he is a legitimate high priest whose loyalties were pro-Egyptian and was an obstacle to their hopes. And so during his temporary absence from the country and with the concordance of the king's government, his brother Jesus, or Joshua really, who changed his name to the Greek form Jason, was appointed high priest in his stead with the help of the substantial tribe of the king, according to 2 Maccabees 4, verses 7 through 10. And so Antiochus, no doubt regarded his appointment as a wise political move, and permission was given to remodel Jerusalem in the Hellenistic lines. First Maccabees chapter 1, 11 through 15. And so this is when the idea comes that gymnasium is going to be built in Jerusalem, and many Jews will dress after the Greek fashion. And and probably today, if we would allow some of the things that goes on, we would find that if our liberal people goes so far to the left, they may come up someday that we don't need to wear clothing anymore. So, we'd probably have people that claim to be religious, that is influenced by that of the Christ, that will do the very same thing, because I don't see anything wrong with it, but there is something wrong with it. When we come back from our break, we're going to read from the Second Maccabees. We made reference to it, so we're going to read exactly what we're told there in the Maccabees. You'll be able to understand what's going on with these two rivals. Okay, so let's take 15 minutes for break. All right, we've gotten down where we're going to read from Second Maccabees chapter 4, 7 through 10. We were talking about the rival houses of that of Antiochus the fourth, reference to that of the high priesthood during his time of the high priesthood, in reference to Jason, and that of Onias. So we find he says, but after the death of the Seleucids, when Antiochus called Epiphanes took the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, labored underhand to be high priest, promising unto the king intercession 303 score talents of silver, and of another revenue 80 talents. Besides this, he promised to assign 150 more if he might have license to set him up a place for exercise and for training up of youth in the fashions of the heathen, and to write them of Jerusalem by the name of Antiochus. In other words, when I read that, stop and think, like they're going to give them a name like, New York Jets or something, Atlanta Falcons. Which when the king had granted, he had gotten into his hand the rule of forthwith, brought his own nations to Greekish fashion. In chapter 1, First Maccabees, in the beginning, verse 11, in those days when went there out of Israel wicked men, persuaded men, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people went so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. Whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised and forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to the mischief. So again, we find that the influence, the cultural influence upon the Jewish people, it really took off with some of them in reference to what they, all the things they're doing. I just cannot understand how, some people, sometimes we talk about circumcision, and you can imagine, because the Gentile people, if they wanted to become a Jew, they had to be circumcised. I asked a doctor one time about circumcision. He says, no. He says, well, today, when you're an older person, would have to actually put you in ICU for 2 days. And I said, you got to be kidding me. And he says, no. And so you can imagine what these people here, they were making themselves uncircumcised. I don't know. Orthodox Jews, and in particular the Hasidim, or pious ones, the predecessors of predecessors of the Pharisees. They came before the Pharisees, but they eventually became the Pharisees. Were deeply incensed at this happening, and indeed, at the spread of the Hellenistic influence generally, because they's real strict about the law. And so to them, the appointment of the high priest was an act of God, which had nothing to do with the approval or disapproval of the Gentile king. And so their own consolation was that the new high priest, Jason, was at least a member of the Orthodox party, but this situation was soon to be altered. For at this point, one Menelaus, who was not even a member of the high priestly family, ousted Jason from the office with the help of the Tobite, and by offering the king a larger bribe. His rival. It's just amazing when you go back and you look at what's going on, because we see that among them, but we saw that also among that of the kings back in the Old Testament. But it goes on, second Maccabees chapter 4, verse 23, and we're going to read that in just a few moments, because it gives us some details about all this. The followers of Menelaus supported the Greek way of life and set themselves up against the Orthodox party. So the split between these two sections of people widened, and fighting broke out in Jerusalem because of the Hellenistic and the Orthodox parties. It was encouraged by a rumor that Antiochus had died in a campaign, and we talked about this earlier, but we didn't go into details in reference to that and what the Maccabees says in Second Maccabees, down in chapter 5 and verses 5 forward. So we're going to read all the way down through those, and I know it's a long reading. To me, it's kind of interesting to read. Second Maccabees chapter 4, beginning verse 23 down to chapter 5 and verse 14. It says, 3 years afterward, Jason sent Menelaus, the aforesaid Simon's brother, to bear the money unto the king, and to put him in mind of certain necessary matters. he being brought to the presence of the king, when he had magnified him for the glorious appearance of his power, gave the priesthood to himself, offering more than Jason by 300 talents of silver. So he came with the king's mandate, bringing nothing worthy to the high priest, nothing worthy high priest, but having the fury of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage beast. And Jason, who had undermined his own brother, being undermined by another, was compelled to flee into the country of the Ammonites. So Menelaus got the principality, but as for the money that he had promised to the king, he took no good order for it, albeit so Stratus, the ruler of the castle, required it, for unto him appertained the gathering of the customs, wherefore or they were both called before the king. Now Menelaus left his brothers Lysimachus in his stead in the priesthood, and so Stratus left Crates, who was governor of the Cyprians. While those things were enduring, they of Tarsus and the Malus made insurrection because they were given to the king's concubine called Antiochus. Then came the king in all haste to appease matters, leaving Andronicus, a man in authority, for his deputy. The deputy or Menelaus, supposing that he had gotten a convenient time, stole certain vessels of gold out of the temple and gave some of them to Andronicus, and sold some he sold unto Tyrus and the cities around about. Which, when Onias knew of a surety, he reproved him and withdrew him into the sanctuary of Daphne, and that lies by Antiochia, where for Menelaus, taken Andronicus apart, prayed him to Onias into his hand, to be persuaded thereunto, coming to Onias in deceit, gave him his right hand with oaths. And though he was suspected by him, yet persuaded he him to come forth of the sanctuary, whom forthwith he shut up with regard of justice. For the which cause, not only the Jews, but many also of other nations took great indignation and were much grieved for the unjust murder of the man. And when the king was come again from the palace of Sicilia, and the Jews were of Cilicia, the Jews that were in the city, and certain of the Greeks that abhorred the fact also complained because Onias was slain without cause, and therefore Antiochus was heartily sorry and moved to pity and wept because of the sober and modest behavior of him that was dead. And being kindled with anger forthwith, he took away Andronicus his purple and rent off his clothes and leading him through the whole city until that very place where he had committed impiety against Onias, and there slew he the cursed murder. And then the Lord rewarded, thus the Lord rewarded him with his punishment as he deserved. Now, when many sacrileges had been committed by the city by Lysimachus, with the consent of Menelaus, the fruit thereof was spread abroad, and the multitude gathered themselves together against Lysimachus. Many vessels of gold being already carried away were upon the common people rising and being filled with rage. Lysimachus armed about 3,000 men and began to first to offer violence. One Alranus being the leader, a man far gone in years and no less in folly. They then, seeing a tenth of Lysimachus, some of them caught stones and clubs, and others handfuls of dust that was at next at hand, cast them all together at Lysimachus and those that sat upon them, and thus many of them they wounded, and some they struck to the ground, and all of them they forced to flee. But as for the church robber himself, him they killed besides the treasury of these matters. Therefore, there was an accusation against Menelaus. Now, when the king came to Tyrus, 3 men that were sent from the Senate pleaded the cause before him, and Menelaus, being now convicted, promised Ptolemy, the son of Doramenes, to give him some more money, so give him much money, if he would pacify the king toward him. So whereupon Ptolemy taking the king aside into a certain gallery, as it were, to take air, brought him to be of another mind, insomuch that he discharged Menelaus from the accusation, notwithstanding, was cause of all the mischief. And those poor men who, if they had told their cause, yea, before the Scythians, should have been judged innocent, then he condemned to death. Thus, they that followed the matter for the city and for the people and for the holy vessels did soon suffer unjust punishment. Wherefore, even they of Tyrus, moved with hatred of the wicked deed, caused them to honorably be buried. And so, through the covenants of them that were of the power of Menelaus, remain still in authority, increasing in malice and being a great traitor to the citizen. Now, what chapter 5? He says, after the same time, Antiochus prepared his second voyage into Egypt, and then it happened that all through the city for the space of 40 days, there were seen horsemen running in the air in cloth of gold and armed with lances like a band of soldiers and troops, horsemen in array, encountering and running one against another, with shaking of shields and multitude of pikes and drawing of the swords and casting of the darts and the glittering of the golden ornaments and a harness of all sorts. Wherefore, uh, well, place. Wherefore, every man that had apparition might turn to good. Now, when there was gone forth a false rumor, as though Antiochus had been dead, Jason took at least 1,000 men and suddenly made an assault upon the city. They that were upon the walls being put back, in the city at length taken, Menelaus fled into the castle. Jason slew his own citizens without mercy, not considering that to get the day of them of his own nation would be a most unhappy day for him, but thinking that they had been enemies and not countrymen whom he conquered. Howbeit, for all this, he obtained not the principality, but at last received shame for the reward of his treason, and fled again into the country of the Ammonites. In the end, therefore, he had an unhappy return, being accused before Artus, the king of the Arabians, fleeing from city to city, pursuit of all men, hatred as a forsaker of the law, and being had an abomination as open enemy of his country and his countrymen. He was cast out of Egypt. Thus, he had been driven out of their country, perished in a strange land, retiring the Lacedaemonians. That's the last demonians, and thinking there to file succor reason of his kindred, and he had cast out many unburied and had none to mourn for him, and nor any solemn funerals at all, nor sepulchre with his fathers. And now, when this that was done came to the king's ear, he thought that Judea had revolted. Upon removing out of Egypt in a furious mind, he took the city by force of arms and commanded his men of war not to spare such as they met, and to slay such as went upon the houses. Thus there was killing of young and old, making way of men, women, and children, slaying of virgins and infants, and there were destroyed within the space of 3 whole days 80,000. That's 4 times 20. That's 80,000. Whereof 40,000 were slain in the conflict, and no fewer sold in slain. That was 40,000 slaves that would go off. So now you look at what happens. I mean, like I said, they go back and they can read the Old Testament, and we can read the Old Testament and see some of the same things happen after that of Solomon in reference to that of the kingdom and so forth. So the pattern was already set for the coming struggle. The conflict that was to follow was not simply a matter of Jews versus Syrians, but Jews versus Jews. And so, for over against the Hellenizing party in Jerusalem, the vast majority of the Jews in the surrounding country were lined up in opposition to any policy of Hellenization. And so, Dr. Osterley remarks during a considerable part of the 2nd century BC, Jerusalem versus Judea correctly describes Jewish internal affairs. And so, when we come to that of the New Testament, we can see, because again, in this period of time, all of this is taken on. We're 100 so years away from that of the coming of Christ and so forth, and we can see that when we come, there is still this big problem among that of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, these two different Jewish sects. And so they would have this problem: Jerusalem versus Judea. You'll know in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8 that Jesus says that you'll be witnesses unto me to Jerusalem and Judea. You go to Jerusalem and Judea. So the Jerusalem was to be preached to first, and then you go on to Judea, then Samaria, then other parts of the earth. So there were those problems between Jerusalem and versus Judea. So amazing to me how that they're not together. The Jewish people are not together in all of this time. It looked like they would have learned. I mean, they once carried off 722 BC in the Assyrian captivity, and then 586 BC they were taken off in Babylonian captivity. Like they would have learned in reference to all the things that they had gone through. Their forefathers, surely they knew about all those things. The historians and so forth that are writing about it. Then you have the vengeance of that of Antiochus. The rumor concerning the death of Antiochus was proved false, and the king returned determined that Palestine must submit to his avowed policy of unifying his kingdom by means of a Hellenic culture and religion. So no doubt his determination was strengthened by reason of his fear of the growing power of Rome. And we brought that up in some other discussions in reference to that because of they were consolidating their empire. So he wanted to consolidate his empire, and so he needed to consolidate his empire. So the removal of his protege, Menelaus, from the high priestly office would be considered an affront to his royal dignity, and so he resolved to wreak vengeance on the Jews. So accordingly, he attacked Jerusalem, drove out Jason, and restored Menelaus to the office. So his soldiers were let loose and massacred many among the people. The temple was desecrated and the sacred vessels plundered. I don't know how, but he thought he was, that was going to happen. But in First Maccabees, I mean, you're kind of want them to be at peace, but this doing this in Maccabees chapter 1, beginning verse 20, it says, and after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again in the 143rd year, so 143 BC, and went up against Israel and Jerusalem with a great multitude and entered proudly into the sanctuary, and took away the golden ark of the candlestick of light and all the vessels thereof. And the table of showbread and the pouring vessels and the vials and the censers of gold and the veil and the crown and the golden ornaments that were before the temple, all which he pulled off. I want to stop there because it makes me think about, if you got to see the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark and some of the others, they didn't want to touch those things. But here we find that's a false concept because here we find that they're doing the very same thing. I mean, they're taking all of everything that's in there. He took also the silver and the gold and the precious vessels, and also he took the hidden treasures which he found. I would assume that in reference to the Raiders of the Lost Ark type thing, is that they were assuming what happened to Nadab and Nadab. Uh, I can't think of his name now. Yeah, Nadab and Abihu, priests in Leviticus chapter 10. Yeah, Nadab and Abihu. Leviticus 10, 1 and 2, that you touch that thing, you're going to die. But he goes on in verse 24 of First Maccabees. He says, and when he had taken all away, he went into his own land, having made a great massacre, and spoke very proudly. Therefore, there was a great mourning in Israel, every place where they were, so that the princes and the elders mourned, the virgins and the young men were made feeble, and the beauty of women was changed. Every bridegroom took lamentation, and she that sat in the marriage chamber was inhabited. The land was moved from its inhabitation thereof, and all the house of Jacob was covered with confusion. You can imagine there. I mean, their place of worship was destroyed. This is where they were supposed to worship, but yet, had they not caused, they had caused a lot of it themselves because of the making friends with all of the people outside that of Judaism and bringing the culture that was bringing in. They could have stopped some of that. So it soon became obvious that although he had the support of the Hellenizers in Jerusalem, that his policy of Hellenization was violently opposed by the bulk of the people. Antiochus we're talking about, in addition, refused to determined to wipe out the Jewish religion altogether, 168 BC. So he set about destroying those very features of Judaism, which ever since the time of captivity had been regarded as distinctive characteristics of the Jewish faith. And so we'll look at that in a minute. The reference there is First Maccabees, verse 1. We'll read some of that. about 13, 14 verses. And all Jewish sacrifices were forbidden. The rite of circumcision was to cease. Sabbath and feast days were no longer to be observed. Disobedience in any of these respects carried the penalty of death. Moreover, the books of the Torah or the law was disfigured or destroyed. Jews were forced to eat swine's flesh and to sacrifice an adulterous altar at an idolatrous altar set up throughout the land. And then to crown his deeds of infamy, he erected an altar of Olympian Zeus with an image of the god probably bearing the features and tickets of himself on the altar of burnt offerings within the temple court. It is this altar which the writer of the book of Daniel calls the abomination of desolation, Daniel chapter 11 and verse 13. So in First Maccabees chapter 1, beginning verse 41, is moreover King Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So all heathens agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yea, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed his idols and profaned the Sabbath. Now, that reminds me in reference to that of Caesar worship that's going to come up in close to the end of the Maccabean period. And as they, during the New Testament times, for the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah that they should follow the strange laws of the land and forbid burnt offerings, sacrifices, and drink offerings in the temple, that they should profane the Sabbaths and festival days. It says, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves, chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts. They should also leave their children uncircumcised and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation, to the end that they might forget the laws and change all of the ordinances, and whosoever will not do according to the commandment of the king, that he should die. So in the self same manner wrote he to his whole kingdom and appointed overseers over all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city. Then many of the people were gathered together to witness, know everyone that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land and drove the Israelites into secret places, even wheresoever they could flee for suffering. And so the thing of it is, when you read that again, you may should go back until the times of that of the prophets when they were prophesying, and we find that during the times that all after that of Solomon, everything Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and how they began to destroy one another. And we can even look into that of David's life and see how his own children, dealt with that of the hierarchy of the kingdom. Here we find that he destroys everything, but also in destroying everything, we mean everything. He takes everything away from the Jewish people. It goes on, verse 54. It says, "Now the 15th day of the month of Caslu, in the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side, and burnt incense at the doors of their houses and in the streets. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burnt them with fire. And whosoever was found with any book of the testament or of any commitment to the law, the king's commandment was that they should be put to death. Thus did they by their authority unto the Israelites every month to as many as were found in the cities. Now the 25th day of the month, they did sacrifice upon the idol altar. And he said there, well, lost my place. And built altars, which was upon the altar of God. Now, the altar of the idol was upon top of the altar of God. Which time, according to the commandment, they put to death certain women. They had caused their children to be circumcised, and they hanged the infants about their necks and rifled their houses, or riffled their houses, and slew them that had circumcised them. And howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat anything, any unclean thing, wherefore they chose rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meat, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died, and there was very great wrath in Israel. Now Daniel 11:31 says, "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." Now that's interesting because, again, like I said, I'm studying Fairmount, Georgia Church of Christ, with the Book of Revelation, and that brings us up to Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, where they bring up that Daniel chapter 11 verse 31, and that would actually be the destruction of the city of Jerusalem in AD 7. Interesting to go back and read what Antiochus actually had done in reference to that of the temple there in Jerusalem, especially going over and have an idol god put on top of the altar of God and asking them to offer sacrifice. Excuse me. These events were followed by severe persecution in which many were put to death. That was verses 57 to 64 we just read. And to this period belong the stories, and partly legendary, told in 2nd Maccabees chapter 6 to 7 of the martyrdom of Eleazar and the 7 brothers, and many left the cities and crowded out into the village where they pursued by government agency intent on stamping out the Jewish faith. Now, like I said, they say that that story is partly legendary. It's a couple of chapters of that, and I'm going to read it because it, to me, helps us to try to understand what really was going on along around that of the Jewish people because of Antiochus, what he was trying to do. In other words, he was trying to put everybody, all the Jewish people, to death. But we have to stop being students of that of the Bible, Genesis 49 and verse 10, that the scepter shall not depart out of Judah. And Christ is out of Judah. Christ is going to be born. All the things that are prophesied, remember Luke 24 and 44, Jesus points out that everything concerning him in the law and in the prophets and in the Psalms concerning him, he says, hath been fulfilled. So everything had to be fulfilled. And so therefore, all the things that prophesied that Jesus, the Messiah was coming in the books of the prophets of the Old Testament, those things had to come to pass. In other words, like Isaiah 7 verse 14, talking about the virgin birth of Christ. So all that had to come to pass. And so we find that he tries to do all of this. And so we'll read that. It begins in chapter 6. Are you you reading your own there, Jim? Are you reading your
Yes.
own version of this? Is it the same as mine?
It's much like this.
Okay. If you find anything different, let me know. Okay, he starts in chapter 6. He says,
Okay.
Not long after this, the king sent an old man of Athens to compel the Jews to depart from the laws of their father and not to live after the laws of God, and to pollute also the temple in Jerusalem, and to call it the temple of Jupiter Olympius, and that in Garzium of Jupiter the defender of strangers, as they did desire that dwell in the place. The coming of this mischief was sore and grievous to the people, for the temple was filled with riot and ravening by the Gentiles, who dallied with harlots and had to do with women within the circuits of the holy place, and besides that, brought in things that were unlawful. The altar was filled with profane things, which the law forbiddeth. Neither was it lawful for a man to keep Sabbath days or ancient fasts, or to profess himself himself at all to be a Jew. And in the day of the king's birth, every month, they were brought by bitter complaint to eat the sacrifices. When the feast of Bacchus was kept, the Jews were compelled to go in procession to Bacchus, carrying ivy. Moreover, there went out a decree to the neighboring cities of the heathen by the suggestion of Ptolemy against the Jews that they should observe the same fashions and be partakers of their sacrifices. And whoso would not conform themselves to the manners of the Gentiles should be put to death. And might a man have seen the present misery, for there were 2 women brought who had circumcised their children, who when they had openly led round about the city, the babes hanging at their breast, they cast them down headlong from the wall, and others that run together in caves nearby to keep the Sabbath day secret, being discovered by Philip, were all burnt together because they made a conscience to help themselves for the honor of the most sacred day. I beseech thee, teach those that read this book that they be not discouraged from their calamities, but that they judge those punishments not to be for destruction, but for chastising of our nation. For it is a token of great goodness when wicked doers are not suffered any longer, forthwith punish, for not as with other nations, whom the Lord patiently forbeareth to punish till they be come to the fullness of their sins, so dealeth he with us, lest that being come to the height of sin, afterwards he should take vengeance of us, and therefore he never withdraweth his mercy from us. And though he punish with adversity, yet he never forsake his people, but let this that we have spoken be for a warning unto us, and not now will we come to the declaring of the matter in a few words. Eleazar, one of the principal scribes, an aged man in the well-favored countenance, was constrained to open his mouth and to eat swine flesh. But he, choosing rather to die gloriously than to live stained with an abomination, spit it forth and came up his own court to torment, as it behooved them to come that are resolute to stand out against such things as are not lawful for love of life to be tasted. But they that had the charge of that wicked feast, no acquaintance they had with the man, taking him aside, besought him to bring flesh of his own provision, such as was lawful for him to use, and make as if he did eat of the flesh taken from the sacrifice commanded by the king, that in so doing he might be delivered from death, and from for the old friendship with their fine favor. But he began to consider discreetly, and as became his age and the excellency of his ancient years and the honor of his gray head, was come, and his most honest education from a child, or rather the holy law made and given by God. Therefore he answered accordingly, and willed them straight ways to send him to the grave. For it becometh not our age, said he, in any wise that this simple, whereby many young persons might think of that Eleazar, being fourscore years old and 10, were not gone to a strange religion. And so that though through my hypocrisy and desire to live a little time and a moment longer should be deceived by me, and I get the stain my old age and make it abominable. For though for the present time I should be delivered for the punishment of men, yet should I not escape the hand of the Almighty, neither alive or dead. Therefore now, manfully changing this life, I will show myself such a one as my age requireth, and leave a notable example to such as to be young to die willingly and courageously for the honorable and holy laws. And when he had said these words, immediately he went to the torment. They led him, changing the good will, they bare him a little before into hatred, because the foresaid speech proceeded, as they thought, from a desperate mind. But when he was ready to die with stripes, he groaned and said, it is manifest unto the Lord that hath the holy knowledge, that whereas I might have been delivered from death, I now endure sore pains in body by being beaten, but in soul am well content to suffer these things, because I fear him. Thus this man died, leaving his death for an example of noble courage and a memorial virtue, not only unto young men, unto all his nation. So we read about someone there that was a martyr, just like Polycarp would have been, as we were to go to around 100 AD in reference to Polycarp. In chapter 7, he says it came to pass also that 7 brethren with their mother were taken, compelled by the king again to against the law to take swine flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whip. But one of them that spake first said, what wouldest thou ask or learn of us? We are ready to die, rather than transgress the law of our fathers. Then the king, being in a rage, commanded pans and cauldrons to be made hot, which forthwith being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongues of them that spake first, and cut off the uttermost parts of his body, the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on. Now when he was thus maimed in all his members, he commanded him yet alive to be brought to the fire, and to be fried in the pan. And as the vapors of the pan was for a good space dispersed, they exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully, saying thus, Lord God looketh upon us, and in truth hath comforted us, as Moses in his song, which witness to their faces declared, saying, he shall be comforted for his servant. Now stop there. Notice what he says. It says, as Moses in his song. Therefore, it shows that they were students. They knew what the Old Testament said, and they had copies of it, but they remember, they destroyed all the things. Antiochus had destroyed all of them. It says, so when the first was dead after this number, they brought the second to make him a malting stock, And when they had pulled off the skin of his head with their hair, they asked him, wilt thou eat before thou be punished throughout every member of thy body? He answered in his own language and said, no. Wherefore he also received the next torment in order as the former did. And when he was at the last gasp, he said, thou like a fury, takest us out of this present life, but the King of the world shall rise us up, who have died for his laws unto everlasting life. Stop there. And you notice they believed, according to what they believed in the immortality of the soul, which we talked about earlier, which was some of the culture back then. But even because the Old Testament teaches that also. After him was the third, a malkin stock, and when he was required, he put out his tongue um, and that right soon, holding forth his hand manfully, and said courageously, these I have from heaven, and for his laws I despise them, and from him I hope to receive them again, in so much that the king and that they that were with him marveled at the young man's courage, for that he nothing regarded the pain. Nor now, when this man was dead, also they tormented and mangled the fourth in like manner. So when he was ready to die, he said thus, it is good, being put to death by men, to look for hope from God, to be raised up again. And as for thou shalt have no resurrection, for thou have no resurrection of life. Afterwards they brought the filth also and mangled him. Then took he unto the king and says, thou hast power over men, thou art corruptible, thou doest that what thou wilt, yet think that not that our nation is forsaken by God, but abide a while, and behold his great power, and how he will torment thee and thy seed. After him also they brought the sixth, who being ready to die said, be not deceived without cause, for we suffer these things for ourselves, having sinned against our God. Therefore marvelous things are done unto us. But think not thou that take us in hand to strive against God, that thou shalt escape unpunished. But the mother was marvelous above all, and the worthy of the honor remember, for which she saw her 7 sons slain in the space of one day, bury it with good courage, because of the hope that she had in the Lord. Yea, she exhorted every one of them in her own language, filled with courageous spirits, and stirring up womanish thoughts with a manly stomach. She said unto them, I cannot tell how you came into my womb, for I neither gave you breath nor life, neither was I that formed the members of every one of you, but doubtless the creator of the world, who formed the generation of man, found out the beginnings of all things, will also of his own mercy give you breath and life again, as you now regard not your own selves for the law's sake. Notice there the things that she is saying, doubtless the creator of the world. How did she know that? Again, being taught who formed the generation of man. In other words, he created man, found out the beginning of all things. In other words, he began all things. So, they were kind of very knowledgeable people. And so some people do not believe, they say these are legends. Now, Antiochus thinks himself despised and suspected it to be a reproachful speech. While the youngest was yet alive, did not only exhort him by words, but also assured him with oaths that he would make him both a rich and a happy man if he would turn from the laws of his father, that also he would take him for his friend and trust him with his affairs. But when the young man would in no case hearken on him, the king called his mother and exhorted her that she would counsel the young man to save his life. And when he had exhorted her with many words, she promised him that she would counsel her son. But she, bowing herself toward him, life and the cruel tyrant that scorned, spake in her country language on this matter. O my son, have pity upon me that bare thee 9 months in my womb, gave thee suck 3 years, nourished thee and brought thee up until this age, and endured troubles of education. I beseech thee, my son, look unto the heaven and the earth, and all that is therein. Consider that God made them of things that were not. I think that's very important. In other words, God spoke them into existence. And so was mankind made wise. Fear not their tormentor, but being worthy of thy brethren, take thy death, that I may receive thee again in mercy with thy brethren. While she yet spake, was yet speaking these words, the young man said, whom wait for you? Whom wait ye for? I will not obey the king's commandment. I will obey the commandment of the law that was given unto our fathers by Moses. Now he's a young fellow. And thou that hast been the author of all mischief against the Hebrews shall not escape the hands of God. Very courageous. suffer because of our sins, and though the living Lord be angry with us a little while for our chastisement and correction, yet shall he be at one again with his servants. How, O godless man, all other most wicked, be not lifted up without a cause, nor puffed up with uh, uncertain. I lost my spot again. Well, let me go back to verse 33. And thou, the living Lord, will be angry with us for a little while, and our chastising corrected. He shall be at one with his servants. But thou, godless man, of all other most wicked, be not lifted up without a cause, nor puffed up with uncertain hope, lifting up thy hand against the servants of God. For thou hast not yet escaped the judgment of Almighty God, who seeth all things. Our brethren who now have suffered a short pain are dead under God's covenant of everlasting life. But thou, though the judgment of God, shall receive just punishment for thy pride. But I am, my brethren, offered up my body and life for the laws of our Father, beseeching God that he would speedily be merciful unto our nation, that thou by torments and plagues mayest confess that he alone is God, and that in me and my brethren the wrath of Almighty God, which is justly brought upon our nation, may cease. He goes on, it says, and the king being in a rage. I stop and say, why did he let him go on and on and on with that? But then he was in a rage, handed him worse than all the rest. It took it grievously that he was balked. So this man died undefiled and put his whole trust in God. Last of all, sons of the mother died. This, let this be enough now to be spoken concerning the idolatrous feast and extreme torture. Pretty interesting, even though, like I said, that about the seven sons there, that they say that that's probably a legend. I thought it was interesting, even though that it may be a legend, but it may be true. It looks like to me they were kind of very courageous, what they had to say. Then you had the Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. Very soon, passive resistance gave way to open aggression, the spark of a revolt from the village of Modin, that which is it's northwest of Jerusalem. And the one there was a priest, Mattathias, we talked about him, of the house of the Hasmon. And he lived with his five sons, First Maccabees chapter 2, verse 1. And I don't put them down. Chapter 2. So that is chapter, some part of chapter 23 to 28 we will do. We've talked about the five sons of Mattathias. When a Syrian official refused to comply, but slew a renegade Jew who did sacrifice, at the same time killed the Syrian official. Was the signal for Mattathias and his sons to flee to the mountains, where they were joined by zealous Jews. We're going to read about that in a minute. Of particular importance was the accession to their ranks and hasn't. So we'll see that too. The whole Hellenistic culture and foreign influence were anathema, where their presence gave full religious sanction to the revolts. They could hardly be called a party within Judaism. But they formed a very party of a body of opinion. They came in the main poorer class and from the country districts, but numbered among them some prominent men. Their obvious piety and religious zeal were to be vital factors in the future life of the nation. So their attitude is vividly expressed in the book of Daniel, which in its present form, the rate was composed in the time of Antiochus by one of the Hasidics, according to Mr. So watch this. He says we start there, and let me do something right quick, and that way I'll be. He begins in First Maccabees chapter 2, verse 23 down to 28. And then we're going to jump to verses 42 to 48. He says, now when he had left speaking these words, there came one of the Jews in the sight to all to sacrifice on the altar which was in Modin, according to the king's commandment. Which thing, when Mattathias saw, he was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled. Neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar. And the king's commissioner, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time, and the altar pulled down. Thus felt he zealously for the law of God, like a Chinese did unto Zimri, the son of Solomon. And Mattathias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, whosoever is zealous to the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me. And so he and his sons fled to the mountain, left all that ever they had in the city. Now, then notice that beginning in verse 42. Then came there unto a company of Assadim, who were mighty men of Israel, even all such as were voluntarily devoted unto the law. Also, all they that fled from persecution joined themselves unto them and were a stay with him. So they joined their forces and smote sinful men in their anger and wicked men in their wrath, but the rest fled to the heathen for succor. Then Mattathias and his friends went round about and pulled down the altars. What children soever they found with in the coast of Israel, uncircumcised, those they circumcised valiantly. And they pursued also after the proud men, and the work prospered in their hand. And so they recovered law out of the land of the Gentiles and out of the hands of the kings. Neither suffered they the sinner to triumph. So the revolt which followed was led in turn by three Mattathias' son. And we talked some about this, and we talked about Judas, 166, 160 BC, surnamed Maccabeus, the hammer. Notice there's a question mark there in the notes. Jonathan, there's 160, 143 BC. They were older, so they're not going to reign long periods of time. And Simon, 142 to 134 BC, marked success followed their campaigns. On the 24th day of Shefli, that's the Jewish calendar, December the 25th, 165 BC, on the very day on which it had been desecrated 3 years before, First Maccabees 454, the temple was cleansed and rededicated under the leadership of Judas, and the worship restored. First Maccabees chapter 4, verse 36, Second Maccabees 7. Now, this event had been commemorated ever since in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah dedication, sometimes known as the Festival of Lights. So we hear about Hanukkah and so forth. Fighting continued, but in 162 BC, Lysis, regent of Antiochus IV, made generous terms with Judas and granted a free pardon to the rebels and full religious liberty. Maccabees 6, beginning verse 58, and also Maccabees 13:3. To conciliate them further, he commanded that Menelaus be put to death. Assadim, whose purpose had been religious and not political, this time saw their aim fulfilled, and so withdrew their support from the Maccabees. And this is indicated in the support they gave one Alchemus, who Demetrius the first, the successor to Antiochus, appointed high priest. And so he was recognized by Hasidim as a true high priest of the Aaronite line. Judas, however, was not content with religious freedom, sought political independence. So after some initial success, the Jews were defeated. However, Judas himself was slain at El Lasa in 160 BC, beginning chapter 9, verse 18, beginning. And so Alchemist died shortly afterwards, and for the next 7 years, Jerusalem was without a priest. I think that shows on that list that I gave. They did not have a priest. So Jonathan was now succeeded by his brother Judas as leader of the nationalist Jew with the help of his other brother Simon. So it was the time of intrigue in which several rivals staked their claims to the Syrian throne. 153 BC, Demetrius I, 162 to 150 BC, had to deal with such a rival in the person of Alexander Balus, who claimed to be the son of Antiochus IV, and both men tried to court the friendship of Jonathan. And in the end, Balus, 150 to 145, outbid Demetrius by appointing him high priest in 152 BC. Now, that's according to First Maccabees 10. We're going to read that in reference to that. I'm going to stop right there and I'm going to drop down and read all that was said. Now, when King Alexander had heard what promises Demetrius had sent unto Jonathan, And also it was told him of the battles and the noble acts which he and his brethren had done, and of the pains that they had endured. That shall we find such another man? Now therefore we will make him our friend and confederate. Upon this he wrote a letter and sent it unto him according to these words saith. In chapter 12 and verse 48, it says, now as soon as Jonathan entered the Ptolemaics, Ptolemy shut the gates and took him and all them that came with him, they slew with the sword. In chapter 13, verse 23, and when he came near Bas Kama, he slew Jonathan, who was buried there. So you see, it is to be observed that the Orthodox party did not elect him high priest. Mostly, most assembly accepted the appointment made by the king. So Jonathan was later confirmed in the high priest by Tryphon, and who was acting on behalf of the infant son of Alexander Bayless. But Tryphon, growing suspicious of Jonathan's power, killed him in 143. We read there in First Maccabees 12, 48, 33. So Simon, who succeeded his brother Jonathan, set about consolidating his position. In 142 BC, and you have to stop and think, among the Jewish people and also the others that were around about during this time. And remember, again, they're dispersed. And so there's a lot of infighting and things going on that it looked like they'd be getting tired of that, what was going on. But in 142 BC, he won from Demetrius II, 145 and 138 BC, immunity taxes, and the Jews proclaimed their independence. In verse Maccabees 13 and verse 41, it says, thus the yoke of the heathens was taken away from Israel in the 117th or 70th year. In First Maccabees 14, beginning in verse 41. It says there, then also verse 47, also that the Jews and priests were well pleased that Simon should be the governor and high priest forever until there should arise a faithful prophet. Now, notice that, a faithful prophet. Now, the prophets had ceased. All the prophets had ceased, you see. Everything had ceased. They had not been hearing anything from God. So then Simon accepted thereof and was well pleased to be high priest and captain, governor of the Jews and priests, and defend them all. Then over in chapter 16, let me go back. Go back to my a decree in bronze, 141 BC, a further step was taken. A decree in bronze was set up in the temple, concerning on him the office of high priest with hereditary rights. Now, this is how that we think of Jonathan as being from the Aaronic priesthood. The Jews and the priests were all well pleased that Simon should be leader and high priest forever until it should rise a faithful prophet. Simon accepted thereunto and ascended to the high priest, and to be a captain and ethnarch of the Jews. We're talking about Simon. He succeeded his brother Jonathan. So the high priest, which had been the hereditary in the house of Onias, had been usurped since the deposition of Onias III, was now made hereditary in the Hasmonean line. So here then we see the emergence of an independent Jewish state in which the civil head and the military leader were at the same time the high priest. So this union was to continue throughout the life of the Hasmonean house. Simon, however, was not to be allowed to die in peace, because in 134 BC he was treacherously slain by his son-in-law Ptolemy, as we talked about. Son John Hyrcanus now succeeded to the high priest, First Maccabees 16-17. Let me see, there it is. Wherefore his heart, he says, First Maccabees 16 begins verse 13. Heart being lifted up, he thought to get to the country to himself, and thereupon consulted deceitfully against Simon and his sons to destroy them. Now Simon was visiting the cities that were in the country and taking care of the good ordering of them, at which time he came down himself to Jericho, which his son Mattathias and Judas in the 176 year, in the 11th month, called Sabbat, when the son of Abubus, I think they say that Abubus, receiving them deceitfully into a little hole called Docus, which he had built, made them a great banquet, howbeit he had hid them there. So when Simon and his sons had drunk largely, Ptolemy and his men rose up and took their weapons and came upon Simon and the Benacquin place and slew him and his 2 sons and certain of the servants. In which doing he committed a great treachery and recompensed people for that of good. So we would find that these were the types of things that continuously go on. Maccabeans, they were kind of like some of those kings back in First and Second Kings that we read about there, and how that they would kill people, and not only that, but they would even kill that of the prophets and so forth because they didn't want to hear what the prophets had to say. So the Maccabeans, in the name of Judaism, had won a resounding victory not only over their foreign enemies, but also over that whole culture, which these enemies were determined to force upon them. But it would be false to imagine that the decisive victory had been won, because it had not. So we're going to be able to study in reference about the Hasmonean house, and we talked some about the Hyrcanus, but we're going to look at from the standpoint of the culture and the political part in reference to that, and we can see some of that taking place in reference to that of the Hasmonean and so forth. I was trying to find read something other, but if I do, I want to get out of order. And I really want to talk about the Hasmonean line all at one time, because it carries us right into Herod and the Romans in reference to the political part and the cultural part of them. And so we will just early, I guess. We will start there on page. This page may change because that's on page 196. May change, okay. But basically, that's what I plan to do, is start there. If I can get it colored. I'm trying to color a whole paragraph so I can see it.
We're going to start at the Hasmonean house.
Yeah, we're going to start there. Like I said, I may change the pages again because of adding something other, but I don't think I've left anything out that I wanted to use, because we've still got about 100 pages I've already done. And I think I've tried to correct things as I've gone through. And some of this is repeat, but the point of it is we're looking from a different standpoint. I'm trying to scroll down. Yeah, we have Herod and the Romans that come up next. Talk more about the Romans, and to look at some things that Josephus has to say. And it will carry us down to 4 BC. And then we will talk about the people of the book. That is talking about these and how they held on to the Torah religion and so forth. That will be interesting also. But next one we'll bring up that other person I sent you, Perky Aboth. We'll bring up some quotes from him and what he had to say. So that's what we'll do. Back over. Oh, I don't have to back.
Now, this Agrippa that I had, Bobby, was word for word what you were reading.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, I took mine. I took mine off of my Logos program instead of out of the book. I've been trying to use this book over here, but I think I'm going to put it back on the shelf because I like to read it of the one that we have on Logos. More up to date when it looks like. But Lord willing, we'll start there next week.
Okay, Bobby.
That will be the day for my birthday. So, day before my birthday.
Do what?
That's the day before my birthday. Yeah. I'll be 37.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. You have a good night.
See you Sunday, Bobby.
All right.